The Great Lakes have a wow factor that is different from any other place in the United States or Canada. For example, when you roam the western states, you'd expect to see the incredible snow-capped peaks of the Rockies. Or when you're exploring the Canadian Maritimes, show-stopping fjords and the awesome power of drifting icebergs just come standard. However, when you're meandering through the Midwest and you stumble upon 6 million billion gallons of fresh water, it has a way of taking you by surprise. Every time. They just seem to pop up out of nowhere, almost like they don't belong there. As it turns out, humankind just so happens to engineer and build unique structures in unlikely places that share that same eerie quality. And that's exactly where we're headed today. Hello, and welcome, my freshwater friends, to episode 17 of the About the Water podcast, an exploration of high strangeness on and around the Great Lakes. Today, we weave our way along the northern shores of Lake Superior. Here, we'll be taken by surprise by both the explainable and the unexplainable, as the sound of steel on steel does and doesn't echo about the water. Episode 17, Freighthopper. As she climbed out into the chilly March air, the warning that the driver had given her was ringing through Avery's head. It'll just come at you from out of nowhere, through the trees, and people have died, so you have to be careful. Avery's roommate, Danica, stepped out of the Jeep as well, thanking her boyfriend, Rowan, for the ride. Look, I'm going to grab a bite to eat. I'll meet you back here in about an hour and a half, and I do have class, so guys, please don't be late, okay? Rowan pleaded. Danica promised him that they wouldn't be, as he pulled off down the dirt surface of Nelson Road towards the Trans-Canada Highway, and out of sight. Avery and Danica took a minute to let their eyes adjust to the still dark morning sky. Avery asked with concern, "Seriously though, what if someone does see us?" Danica looked in all directions. "Like who?" she asked. Aside from a small handful of houses lining the shore of Lake Superior's Thunder Bay, about a half mile to the south, they were isolated. Their hometown of Thunder Bay was now more than a 30-minute drive behind them, and what they stood in now was nothing short of the Canadian wilderness. With an excited smile, Danica pulled on Avery's coat. "All right, this way." Best friends since junior high, Avery and Danica shared just about every common interest that best friends could, including similar career ambitions. They would spend all week hard at work on their degrees at Thunder Bay's Lakehead University, Danica studying architecture and Avery engineering, and weekends were spent doing exactly what they were doing today, exploring the constructed world. In doing so, they had seen architectural magnificence at cities like Toronto and Chicago, as well as the engineering marvels of the Great Lakes region, like the Sioux Locks and the hydroelectric dams around Niagara Falls. Their plan? To one day open a one-stop shop of sorts, where architectural design and engineering know-how would meet. But today they were looking for a different kind of masterpiece. Not one that finds itself surrounded by popular and dense urban areas, but rather one that silently wages war against the forces of nature, alone and forgotten. "So," asked Avery, "this rock path takes you to the train tracks?" Danica stopped, wide-eyed and almost giddy. "No," she replied. "These were the train tracks." Avery's heart sank. She looked around at the dense woods on both sides of the trail, and they were beginning to reclaim the space that had been taken from them well over a century ago. In Danica's love for creepy, abandoned things, their shared interests stopped. "They started tearing out the tracks in like 2008 or 2009, Danica continued. The two spent the 40-minute walk east discussing Danica's extensive knowledge about the old Canadian Northern Railway, now better known as the Canadian National Railway. Their breath was visible in the air. The pine trees around them began to take on a pink hue as sunrise drew nearer, and morning dew covered the ground in the form of a thick layer of frost. "All right, we'll need to be careful not to fall off," Danica said. Avery immediately objected. "You're not actually planning on going out on the thing, are you?" The ensuing argument stopped in an instant as the pair rounded a corner and were taken off guard, just as promised. The woods seemed to fall away at their feet. The vista unfolding in front of them consisted only of the tops of endless expanses of trees, some appearing luminescent from the glowing frost. There were no houses, no highways, no cities or towns, no power lines. The only unnatural structure was the one that they had come to see, and it was magnificent. "That's it," Avery whispered. "That's the trestle." With a disapproving glance, Danica snapped back. "Viaduct," before returning her gaze to the scene before her. "Rookies call it Pass Lake Trestle, but pros call it the Blend River Viaduct," she insisted. They looked down at the railroad ties, adorned with two sets of tracks, one for the lumber haulers and steam engines of old, and the other for the more modern diesels that used the bridge until 2005, when it was decommissioned. The viaduct seemed to defy gravity, continuing 2,200 feet straight out into the sky itself, giving a strange feeling that it was the horizon, and that the rest of the world had simply sunken down 130 feet below it. The fiery orange sky had yet to reveal the sun, as it made the century-old steel seem to glow, as if the incredible structure in front of them were being cast in that very moment. Danica began to step out onto the cross ties when Avery grabbed her arm. "What are you doing?" she asked. "You're not going to cross it." Danica pushed her away, replying, "Relax, I'm just going to go check that out." Avery looked out onto the bridge, asking, "Check what out?" only daring to follow her friend out a couple of dozen feet. "Whoa, there's still stuff inside," Danica shouted back. "Inside of what?" Avery asked, watching in fear as her best friend stood perilously close to the edge, as if trying to avoid the middle of the tracks altogether. Avery suddenly dropped to all fours and began to back up off the bridge. Her fear of heights had kicked in, and all she could do now was bring herself to look straight down and crawl. She shouted to Danica to be careful, reminding her of the frost once again. Once she had reached solid ground, Avery rubbed her eyes and looked up, just in time to see Danica wave again for her to follow, before stepping towards the middle of the tracks and disappearing entirely. Instinct took over. Avery quickly rose to her feet and began to run towards her friend, only to bounce off a chain-link fence and back onto the ground. "What?" Avery asked as she sat upright, shouting her friend's name several more times. She stood up again, observing the fence that had not been there seconds ago. It separated the rock pathway from the bridge and held a warning sign not to trespass out onto it. The fence was tall, 10 to 12 feet, stuck out several feet on both sides of the trestle, as if to discourage people from trying to circumvent it. Avery ran up to it, clinging onto it as she observed the bridge beyond. There was no sign of anyone, no sign of life, no sign of Danica. Unsure as to what to do, Avery just turned around and began to run back as fast as she could towards Nelson Road. She hadn't run more than 60 seconds or so before she saw a pair of headlights racing down the rock pathway towards her. Avery stopped, frantically waving her hands in the air and begging for help. As the vehicle approached, she then recognized it. It was Rowan's Jeep. He was laying on the horn, and Avery ran up to the driver's side and pointed back behind her. "Danica fell off," she said. As Rowan tried to calm her down, Avery just kept repeating, She fell off. Look, there's a road down there. We need to get to it. We need to find her." Rowan held her hand and then motioned towards the passenger seat of the Jeep. Curled up in a ball under a blanket, with a pale face and a frightened expression, was Danica. Avery took a few steps back. No, that's impossible," she said between deep breaths. She just fell off. She just fell off." Danica appeared to be in shock, just staring into the distance. Rowan got out of the Jeep and opened the rear door, gently motioning for Avery to get in. As she did, Danica sat up and looked out the window. The last thing she said before she erupted into hysterical tears was, "Why is there a fence there? The fence wasn't there. The fence wasn't there." The ride back to Thunder Bay was spent without a single word being exchanged. Rowan dropped Avery and Danica off at their shared apartment just off campus. Danica excused herself, suggesting that she needed a warm bath and some time alone. Avery pulled Rowan back outside, asking for any answers that he might have had to what had happened. Rowan suggested they take a drive to clear their minds, saying that he would explain everything that Danica had explained to him as they did. And so they did. Danica told him that she had seen the abandoned railroad cars on the viaduct and that she wanted to take a look. Avery interrupted, explaining that there were no train cars. There was nothing on the track, nothing. Rowan shook his head, trying to make sense out of all of it himself, as he continued. Danica said there was a caboose and 2 boxcars sitting a few hundred feet out onto the viaduct. The side door of the farthest boxcar was open, so she jumped in to take a look. As soon as she did, an old man took her off guard, shouting for her to get out. She didn't even know there was someone else out there. "There wasn't anyone out there," Avery blurted out. "There wasn't anyone else anywhere around." Rowan just nodded and went on. It wasn't until Danica tried to do as the man instructed and get out of the boxcar when she suddenly realized that it was moving. She could see it crossing the trestle, headed further east, away from Avery. The train was going fast, too fast for her to jump off, according to Danica. However, when it did slow down a bit, while going around a long right-hand corner, Danica did take advantage and jumped out. Her legs and knees were pretty scraped up from the rocks alongside the tracks, and as she stood up, she saw nothing. She heard nothing. No train. She looked in both directions, and nothing. Absolutely nothing. Luckily, a couple of tourists happened to see her and were eager to help. "Tourists?" Avery asked. "Yeah," Rowan said. "They pulled off the highway to check out the northernmost point of Lake Superior, which is like right there." He went on to explain that the couple had tried to let Danica use their phone, but there was no reception. So they drove her to the nearest town, Nipigon. Rowan waved his phone. "First she called you, but then I figured you wouldn't have reception, so she called me. So I just went and picked her up." Avery couldn't decide whether to commit to a disbelieving laugh or a terrified crying session, so she sort of combined the two as she explained what she saw. There was no fence, and then there was a fence, nor had there ever been any boxcars or a caboose. She watched as her best friend simply disappeared. She suggested to Rowan that perhaps Danica had fallen off and survived. Her train hallucination could simply be a result of injuries sustained from the fall, and that there was a road below the trestle, so the tourists may have been traveling there when they saw her. Then Avery began to suggest that her friend ought to be taken to a hospital immediately. Rowan put his hand on her shoulder. "Avery, she wasn't at the bottom of the trestle. I picked her up in Nipigon." Avery turned to him. "Rowan, she was gone for literally a minute, 2 at most. I was running the whole time, and you could still see the trestle when you picked me up, remember? She commented about the fence." Rowan took a deep breath. "Avery, Maybe Danica isn't the only one experiencing something strange. Nipigon is 45 minutes each way from where I picked you up. You were on those tracks alone for hours. As we review some of the questions that I'm sure you and I both have, let's begin with a chronological review. The Blend River Viaduct, or Pass Lake Trestle, was constructed in 1912 for use by the Canadian Northern Railway. In 1923, Canadian Northern became a part of Canadian National. The viaduct itself was decommissioned in May of 2005, at which point Canadian National stopped all rail service across it entirely. The railroad tracks on either side of the Blend River Viaduct were removed, as mentioned, beginning in 2008, and depending on the report that we look at, were completely removed by 2009 or 2010. I wasn't able to find a specific date as to when the fence was erected to keep people off the trestle, but I did find some photos of it dating back to 2021, so it could be earlier than that. And strangely enough, all of the events in this story took place in early March of 2025. This story was originally submitted to me by Rowan via email. When he later agreed to meet via video call for some follow-up questions, I was delighted to see that Avery was on screen with him. As I began to ask my usual follow-up questions regarding the trestle, I could hear a distant voice on the other line correct me and shout, "Viaduct!" It was then that Danica joined the call as well, with the roll of her eyes and a smirk that kind of suggested she was eager to talk about it. We started with Rowan's experience. He dropped them off, set a cell phone timer for 90 minutes, and returned to the rendezvous point at Nelson Road in the Trans-Canada Highway on time, almost to the second, he says. He stayed in the car wondering where they were, as another 30 minutes passed before his phone eventually rang from an unknown number, and it was Danica using one of the tourists' phones. After receiving the call, he left immediately for the 45-minute drive to Nipigon. After picking her up, Rowan wasted no time in making the 45-minute drive back, then deciding to drive directly down the abandoned railway itself, finding Avery just a few moments later. Being the only one who seemingly didn't experience anything paranormal, we'll use his story for an accurate frame of time. And when we do, it becomes nearly impossible to determine exactly what happened to whom when it comes to Avery and Danica. Neither one of them was hindered by the fence as they stepped out onto the viaduct, as it simply did not exist for either of them briefly, returning only after Avery had backtracked across the location. Only Danica saw the caboose. During our call, she explained that it was made of wood and was painted slightly more orange than red, and that it featured a large green maple leaf on the side. Such a caboose would have seen production cease in the early 1920s, and although cabooses were increasingly more and more rare as time went on, their service was stopped entirely by 1991. Danica then described the boxcars as modern, CN red with the modern CN logo on them, holding on to the side while standing at the very edge of the trestle's crossties, entering the farthest boxcar, exactly where Avery had seen her disappear. Avery never heard the man that Danica said had shouted at her. With the security fence there, it would have been impossible for someone to even be there anyway. And from here, we get into the most unsettling aspect of the story, the nonsensical variations on time. The estimated 3 hours between when Danica disappeared to when the Jeep pulled up to Avery with Danica inside passed in about 60 seconds from Avery's perspective. And the roughly 1.5-hour journey that Danica had taken makes little sense either. By our research estimate, a train would need to be traveling at between 75 and 100 miles per hour, or between 120 and 160 kilometers per hour, to make the journey in that time, which would be absurdly unheard of for CN Freight, or any North American freight train for that matter. Also, That possibility takes away the obvious issue with there being no physical rail lines on a significant portion of that route for said train to have traveled along in the first place. Similar to where I'm sure we're at, each of the three witnesses of this bizarre ordeal have tried to formulate their own theory as to exactly what happened, and most of those theories seem to fail. When I asked Rowan for his explanation, all he did is shrug his shoulders and say, I don't know, aliens? Avery originally thought that perhaps ghosts were involved, that maybe those who perished during the viaduct's construction were playing some prank on, or making a point to, a couple of trespassers. But after doing my research, I did let her know that while one person was injured in a fall, thankfully nobody died during construction. The construction seemed to be generally very successful. Danica said that her ongoing science courses at the university have left her considering the ordeal with a scientific mindset rather than a metaphysical one. A student of and a subscriber to the multiverse theory, Danica believes that she briefly got some extracurricular hands-on experience in the matter. Would it not be plausible to suggest that in another version of this universe, the viaduct was still operational 20 years later, and that a train would have come to a stop briefly before crossing the trestle, and that a vintage caboose might have been attached to simply transport it from one location to another using the existing rail lines? Danica suggests that perhaps she simply crossed a barrier that Avery didn't. Indeed, this theory does exist on the very fringes of scientific exploration, but at least it's a working hypothesis. And in the Great Lakes region, where mystery and the unexpected rise up like giants out of the trees, it remains an open door on a theoretical boxcar worth exploring. And with that, thank you, sincerely, as always, for listening. And whether they be via highway, or railway, or interdimensional gateway, here's hoping your adventures are as grand, beautiful, and enduring as our Great Lakes. I'll see you about the water.